They told me I was losing it. That phrase, said between a sigh and a shrug, landed like a stone in my chest and sank. I refused to let it rest there. I fought back. I changed my life. And yes, I started eating 2 simple fruits every day. It didn't happen overnight. It wasn't a miracle you could bottle. But little by little, the fog lifted enough for me to find myself again. If you care for an elderly parent or grandparent, if you've ever listened as someone said, maybe she's just forgetful, please pause and comment below. I want to hear your story. We need each other for this. I was a teacher most of my life, not the kind that stood at the front of a fancy school with a laser pointer, but the kind who taught adult literacy at the community center, who stayed late to help someone sound out the word market, who folded assignment papers with my hands because the students liked the way those papers looked like quiet houses on a shelf. My husband Juan and I were married 48 years. We built a life around routines. His papers in the left drawer, my sewing box at the foot of the bed, coffee in the blue mug he called the thinking cup. He used to tease that my memory was a stubborn cat. It would crouch under the table when you called, but it always came back by dinner time. After he died, the cat didn't come back so predictably. Grief has a way of rearranging a house. First, it rearranges the furniture, the empty chair at the table, the space by the bedside where his slippers used to sit. And then, if you aren't careful, it moves you into a smaller room within yourself. I sold our house because it was too many memories and too many creaks when I went to the kitchen at night. My daughter Luciana said, with that urgency of daughters who are also caretakers, "Come live with us. It'll be easier. I'll take care of you." She meant well. She meant love. She also meant control, though she would have blushed to hear me say it that way. Moving in was supposed to be a temporary, sensible plan. She had a spare room with a bedspread I could have stitched for. Her house smelled of lemon cleaner and the faint perfume of her husband's aftershave. For a while, I floated on good intentions. I would teach a class at the community center 2 mornings a week. I'd bring her lasagna. I'd mend shirts. But day by day, the favors started to look like lists. Without meaning to, Luciana began to place me on a schedule that fit her life. "Mom, could you make the salad? We're going to need someone to watch Daniel after school. Oh, please remind me to pick up the dry cleaning." Helpful, yes. Necessary, sometimes. But soon I noticed that her questions came with a tone that assumed I might forget. Not the warm teasing of a family that knows each other's habits, but the cool, clinical tone of someone running a small hotel where guests must be checked on. You don't notice the little cuts at first. Memory loss, when it starts, is like a thin thread wearing through. At first, you just feel a prick. I began to misplace things. Keys in the freezer, a cliche, yes, but true enough to be humiliating. The recipe I had cooked from since 1972. The name of a neighbor I'd baked for every Sunday. I laughed it off to myself. Old bones, old brain, I told the mirror. But my laughter grew more brittle. Things got worse at dinner one evening. Luciana had invited her husband Roberto's cousin and some colleagues from work. She wanted everything perfect and bustling and modern. "Mom," she said sharply, "you promised to fold these napkins." I took the cloth and folded them the way my mother taught me, with the corners tight like sails. Someone laughed at a mismatch, and Roberto, bless him, he often tried to be gentle, but sometimes missed, leaned over in a voice that claimed to be casual and said, "She's been forgetting things. Maybe it's time to talk to the doctor." The room went softer and smaller. The words passed between them like a rumor. Losing it. Dementia. They used it as an explanation for the napkin I had folded wrong, as if a mind could be measured right there on a dinner table. I tried to explain that I'd always folded them that way. They're folded like ships, I said, because humor is one of my survival tools. Luciana smiled in the way people do when their smile is doing the work of a shield. We'll make an appointment, she said. The implied timetable, as if my life were a machine that could be stopped and serviced, left me cold. I felt smaller in a house I had helped raise. The first real shock came on a Saturday when I went to answer the phone and found myself standing in Luciana's kitchen, the phone ringing, my hands damp from washing salad greens. It was a call that woke a part of me. It was Paulo, an old student of mine, a man with a voice like gravel, who had once told me, with tearful pride, that he had finally read a whole book to his wife. He said, "Geralda, do you remember me? I just wanted to tell you I passed my test because of you." I could hear the echo of the community center chairs in his words. I said something to him, something motherly and sharp, and then I searched for those words again and couldn't find them. I had the feeling of a page where the ink was drying, but someone was still speaking. Paulo called back the next day with a letter. He had written me a note, his handwriting looping like vines, thanking me for teaching him to read. He wrote a line that made me drop the letter on the table and press my palm to my heart. "You gave me back my voice." I stared at that sentence until the kitchen blurred. If someone else thought I was losing my mind, here was a person whose life I had changed, saying I was the one who had given. That dissonance made an ache in me so loud it was a kind of clarity. If I had the power to give someone their voice, then perhaps I had the power to take charge of my own. That call, that letter, became a rope thrown into the fog. I decided, not out of rage, but out of stubbornness, to test the truth of my own life. If my memory was slipping because something biological had changed, I would seek help. If it was being worn thin because I had surrendered my routines and my purpose, I would get them back. I did both. I made an appointment with my doctor, and I signed up for the Tuesday morning literacy class at the community center. The doctor was kind and efficient. He ran the expected tests, used the words you see in the brochures, cognitive screening, blood work. He said things like, "We'll monitor this," and "It's important not to jump to conclusions." He did not say, "You're doomed." He did not say, "You're fine." He offered a map without lines. I accepted that. I would walk this road with both feet. But medicine was not the only map I followed. There is a community center on Maple Street that smells like coffee and chalk dust and hope. Carmen runs it. She's the kind of woman who knits her sentences into presents and keeps an emergency jar of biscuits for visitors. When I told her, with as much humility as I could muster, that my head felt like a room where the lights kept switching on and off, she put down her knitting and said, "We've got a table of people who bring fruit each week and talk about what helps them. Not medication talk, mind you, just what keeps you going." That only made me grin. Of course there was a table like that. There is always a table. At that table, I met Benedito, a man who swore by his daily walk and his single cup of black coffee, and Helena, who swore that crossword puzzles and late-night radio had kept her quick. Someone, I think it was Carmen, passed me an old magazine clipped from a health section. The article was cautious and kind and full of those hedging phrases that scientists use. Some studies suggest, may be associated with, further research is required. It spoke of diets rich in certain nutrients, of antioxidants, of plant compounds that seem, in some studies, to support brain health. The language was careful, but the images were persuasive. Bowls of deep blue berries and jewel-toned pomegranate arils sprinkled like rubies. "I used to eat that every morning," Carmen said, tapping her chin as if she were tasting a memory. "A little bowl, you know, not because it would make me young again, but because it made me feel like I was doing something for myself." The way she said, "doing something for myself," had a lift to it, like a small flag hoisted where none had been before. I am a woman of habits, and when I find a habit that resembles dignity, I hold on to it. I didn't go online to order miracle blends or buy into some grand scheme. I went to the market. Blueberries were surprisingly expensive that week, but the stall keeper smiled and slipped me a carton with a few berries extra. Pomegranates, heavy and stubborn, felt like small globes of possibility in my palms. I bought both. I began simple. A handful of blueberries sprinkled over plain yogurt in the morning, a small bowl of pomegranate arils in an afternoon nibble. I did not do it with a twinge of desperation, but with the steady, practical faith of someone who understands that change is often a matter of small, repeated acts. I wrote it down on my calendar next to the Tuesday class. Blueberries plus pomegranate, class. The calendar square looked almost like a promise. I paired the little bowl with other small changes. I set a bedtime and honored it like an appointment with an old friend. I resumed walking, not power walking, just the kind of walk that lets you notice other people's gardens. I taught on Tuesday mornings and ate my blueberries in the classroom like a secret. I told my students stories about syllables that sounded like steps in a shoe. My hands, which had always folded napkins into ships, made little gestures to help someone sound out the word remember. Purpose returned gently, like sunlight through an open curtain. I am careful here because I know how stories get flattened into slogans. I am not saying blueberries and pomegranate are magic. I am saying that for me, they were part of a constellation of small choices that slowly lit the room. The doctor nodded when I told him and said, "Diet, socialization, sleep, these are all factors. Keep doing what you're doing." He emphasized consult your doctor rhetoric, and I agreed. This is my experience, not medical advice. Consult your physician before making changes. The first few weeks felt like watching a slow bloom. I could not say I remembered everything. I still misplaced things, but I noticed lighter things. Names that used to slide away would stop on the edge of my memory and then step back in. A neighbor's dog that I had called Rex for months was suddenly Buster and then Rex again, and neither name felt like a crime. Paulo's handwriting, the looped phrase, "You gave me back my voice," I could recite it without looking at the paper. It was as if the cat of my memory, wary, had stopped hiding and merely peered out from under the sofa. Not everyone welcomed this change. Luciana watched me with a mixture of suspicion and relief. Maybe it's the sleep, she guessed once. Maybe it's the routine. She had said doctor before, now she said routine, the way a person lists ingredients. Roberto was more careful. He would bring me a cup of tea and say, "So, Mom, you feeling better?" As if feeling better were a thing you could wear home from the neighborhood pharmacy. I wanted to tell them both that feeling better was not a single garment. It was a tailoring job, slow, precise, sometimes unfinished. A small victory came 4 weeks in. I was at the community center teaching when a woman I didn't know came up to me afterward and asked if I would speak at her daughter's school. She said, "My daughter is 14 and she thinks she's not good at anything. She needs to hear someone who never gave up." I felt that old teacher's heartbeat, the proud, fierce kind that sets your fingers warm. I said yes without thinking. I told my students I'd be back the next week. After she left, Carmen reached out and squeezed my hand like it was 1979 again. That evening, as I sliced a pomegranate at my daughter's kitchen counter, I remembered the first time I taught someone to read, a young mother who came in with tired eyes and a baby on her chest. I could see the classroom, the chalk dust in the air like suspended winter, the bark of laughter when a reading went wrong, the shiny look in the student's face when she sounded out a paragraph for the first time. The memory arrived whole, not in pieces. I put the bowl of pomegranate seeds beside my chair and ate them slowly, the seeds like coordinated beats of a drum in my mouth. But recovery does not happen in a straight line. One morning, I could not remember where I had left my blue scarf. It was a small thing, but its absence twisted my stomach. Luciana was patient, as she often is. She searched and found it slung over a chair. "See," she said softly, "you're fine." That soft assurance stung because it lumped all my small fears into a tidy box. Later that day, while watering a plant on the balcony, I forgot the name of the poem I had taught for years. The line was on the tip of my tongue like a moth. It did not come. I stood there watering the plant, feeling ancient and ridiculous. There was a conversation one night none of us expected. Luciana and Roberto sat at the table, their faces lit by the microwave clock. They didn't mean to be conspiratorial. They were just, as most people are in kitchens late at night, confessing their anxieties. "Maybe she's doing better," Roberto said, stirring his tea. "But if it comes back the other way," Luciana's voice wrenched a little, "I can't lose my job to be a caregiver, Roberto." I heard them through the half-closed door. I could have interrupted. I could have told them to stop. I sat down on the stairs and folded my hands over my knees. I felt small and enormous at once. Small because they were talking about my life as a risk. Enormous because I could, if I wanted, walk out and find my own solution. That night I did not sleep well. I turned the blue mug over in my hands and remembered Juan's laughter. The way he used to say, "You are stubborn enough to move mountains, Geralda. Try moving one cup instead." I realized then that part of my fog had been self-inflicted by surrender. I had given away pieces of my autonomy to the people I loved. I had allowed their worry to wrap around me like a blanket that didn't fit. I would not be cruel to them. They were doing what they thought was best. But I also would not let my life be reduced to a schedule anyone else arranged without asking me. So I made a plan that felt like breathing. I told them I wanted to live independently again. "I want a small apartment," I said, and my voice was steadier than I felt. Luciana looked surprised and then frightened, as if I had suggested we knock down a wall. "Mom, are you sure?" she asked. "You can't be alone." I understood that fear. It is the same fear that had moved her to invite me in the first place. I reminded her of Paulo's letter. I reminded her of the students whose lives had changed because I sat at a table with them and taught them to read. "I'll be close," I said, "and I'll see you for dinner sometimes." She still worried, but she also knew, in the way only daughters know, how stubborn their mothers can be. Finding an apartment was an exercise in patience. I wanted small but bright, with a window that faced the stars, and a kitchen where I could make coffee without someone telling me to set a timer. I found a place above a bakery, mornings filled with the smell of yeast, evenings with the hush of people settling down. The landlord, a young man named Marcos, who reminded me of my son but was not my son, handed me the keys like a benediction. The first night in that apartment, I stood at the window and watched the city inhale and exhale. I made myself a bowl of yogurt with blueberries and a scattering of pomegranate seeds, and I sat with it like a prayer. There are small humiliations in the beginning of independence. I had to relearn which bus to take. I misread a schedule and found myself chatting with a man named Alberto who told me about the war and then cried when I told him about my husband. He told me his sister used to bake, and I told him about the time Juan set the garden on fire by accident, and we both laughed until our sides hurt. Those human moments began to stitch me back together. The fruits, the sleep, the classes, they were companions on a longer road. Weeks passed, and I kept a small diary. I would scribble a line each night. Woke, blueberries, taught at 10, met Sophia. The diary became a map I could consult like an old friend. It did not cure everything. I still had nights when words did not arrange themselves, and my hands felt like pages that would not turn. I still mislaid my keys. But some things changed. One afternoon, I walked into the community center and, without thinking, started a reading session. Voices gathered like birds. A woman named Teresa, who had never tried reading beyond the headlines, read a paragraph without falter. The room broke into applause. I felt a warmth I had not known I was missing. not just the teacher's pride, but the sense that I belonged to a flow of people giving and receiving. Luciana came by one Sunday with Daniel and brought an apology tucked into her bag like confectionery. I didn't realize how much being in the house was. I didn't see how you felt, she said, letting the words tumble out. She sat down and held my hand like she was bracing against a wind. I'm sorry if I made you feel small. Her voice cracked in the place where love and guilt meet. I could have been harsh. I could have told her every moment she had condescended. Instead, I told her about Paulo's letter and Carmen's table and the blueberries. I told her how sometimes I still lost things, yes, but how often I found things, like names and poems and the muscle of my purpose. She listened. She cried a little. We forgave each other for things we had not meant to do. At the end of that month, I had a small breakthrough that surprised me. I was on the bus heading to the market to buy more pomegranates. They were in season and heavy with juice, when an old song came on the radio. It was the song Zhuang used to whistle in the mornings while he packed his tools. For a second, I was a younger woman standing in a kitchen with sunlight in the floorboards, and then the memory resolved into the present. I could see the color of the mug he used, the exact place he put his hat, the way he always left notes in the laundry basket. I held that memory like a ripe fruit. It tasted like grief and like joy fused. I told myself then that I had not beaten anything in a day. I had not declared victory on some terrible diagnosis. I had instead gathered the small things that form a life and stitched them back into place. A bowl of blueberries in the morning, pomegranate seeds in the afternoon, a return to teaching, a walk that took me past other people's gardens, a mailbox that now contained a note from a former student. The changes were quiet and accumulated like snow. They did not erase the fear. They did not make my family stop worrying, but they changed the conversation we were having about me. There was one moment, though, that kept me awake with a delicious terror. It came on a regular Thursday when the class had run over and the floor smelled like chalk dust and coffee. I was walking home with my bag of groceries, blueberries tucked into a paper bag like a small wet treasure, when I saw a young woman standing in front of the storefront, calling out the name Geralda. I hesitated. The world does not call my name much anymore. She smiled and waved and said, "You taught my sister to read. She wanted to thank you." She reached into her bag and handed me a small note. It read, "Because of you, I could read the prescription the doctor gave my child, and it changed everything." There is a kind of astonishment that is not loud. It sits between the ribs and then loosens them so you can breathe deeper. I felt it then. That steady, clear breath of knowing I had made a difference, and that difference had not evaporated. The balcony light of my small apartment seemed brighter that night. I made a bowl of pomegranate and blueberries and ate them as if they were a tiny private celebration. When I finished, I washed the bowl and set it in the rack like someone who had completed a ritual. I said a small thank you to myself for not giving up. Yet the plot was far from resolved. There remained nights when I woke and could not remember the last thing I had spoken aloud. There remained moments when Luciana's worry moved into actions that felt like control. There remained a reservoir of fear I had to tread carefully. And so I kept going. I kept the fruit in the refrigerator like a promise and the diary on the nightstand like a map. I promised myself I would continue to seek medical advice and community support. I promised to tell my story honestly, not to sell a miracle, but to share what helped me find pieces of myself again. One morning, as part of a plan I had made, and partly because I wanted to make my return undeniable, I prepared a small lesson for the high school where a teacher had invited me to speak. I took the bus with my notes folded in my bag and a container of blueberries snug in my tote. The class was nervous. Teenagers have a way of being politely skeptical of elders. I began with a story about the first book I taught someone to read. Later, a boy raised his hand and said, "How do you keep your memory, Mr. Alda?" The silence that followed felt big enough to hold answers. I could have given him a syllable of advice. I could have said, "Exercise your mind." Instead, I told him about small habits, the bowl of fruit, the walks, the teaching. I told him about Paulo and about the times I got the napkin wrong and how people had said I was losing it. I told him that fight was not just against a thing called Alzheimer's, but against the slow surrender of purpose. He listened. So did the other students. One of them later approached me with a crudely drawn card that said, "Thanks for teaching." I folded that card into my diary. That afternoon, riding home, a thought came that tightened my chest with anticipation. What if I could show others that living with dignity and purpose doesn't belong to youth alone? What if the small things I had done could be made visible and shared? The idea of telling my story beyond the community center, of speaking on a stage or making a small video, flickered like a porch light. It was a bold thought for an old woman. It was also, in its way, appropriate. I had always believed in stories. They have a way of lighting rooms and guiding people through doors. And yet I am mindful of the lines we must not cross. In every conversation I had with doctors, friends, and the people at the center, the same cautionary note played softly. This is personal, not a prescription. Consult your doctor. So I promised to keep that line clear when I spoke. I would not say this would work for everyone. I would say what worked for me and why it mattered. The next morning, I woke with a strange mix of dread and determination. I had arranged to meet Carmen for coffee and then go to the market to buy more fruit. I made myself a bowl, blueberries, a few pomegranate seeds, and sat by the window of my apartment where the light pooled like a lap. As I lifted the first spoonful to my mouth, Luciana called from downstairs. "Mom," she shouted, "we need to talk." Her voice carried that old alarm. I set the spoon down and braced myself. I opened the door to find Luciana holding a pamphlet. It was about memory clinics and full of words I recognized: screening, referral, cognitive decline. Her face was a careful map of worry. "They want to make sure you're okay," she said. "This is about your safety." I felt something inside me tighten like a string. The bowl sat on the counter, blueberries like small planets. I could hand her the whole story, the classes, the market, the swims between memory and forgetting. Or I could open a different kind of conversation. I told Luciana about Paulo's note, about the class, about the apartment above the bakery. I told her about Carmen's table and the magazine article, and about how the fruits had made me feel like I was taking care of myself again. She listened, the pamphlet sliding in her hands like an object she was learning how to hold. She wanted to be reassured. I wanted to be heard. We stood there in the doorway between two houses of understanding. She spoke about practicalities, medication, monitoring, appointments. I spoke about dignity and the small bowl of fruit that started my day. Neither of us won the other over that afternoon, but something changed. She squeezed my hand and said, "Okay, show me. Take me to Carmen's table. Let me see what you're doing." Her concession felt like a small, crucial bridge. We walked to the community center together, my blueberries in a paper bag, and the air hummed with the ordinary business of people living. As we walked, I thought about the long arc behind me and the uncertain road ahead. I thought about the small things that had steadied me and the people who had looked after me without intending to patronize. I thought about telling this story, truly telling it, because I wanted others to know that the fight against being reduced to a diagnosis is not always about dramatic cures, but about reclaiming the small acts that make life recognizably yours. At the door to Carmen's table, a woman I had never met before reached out and touched my arm. "We're glad you're here," she said. I smiled and felt relief like a tide. I sat down and put the bowl of fruit on the table between us like an offering. Carmen nodded as if she understood my small ritual better than I did. That afternoon, as voices rose and a new woman told us about the soup she made for her husband who had trouble with his appetite, a young nutritionist, not a doctor, simply someone who worked with the center, passed around a pamphlet. She spoke carefully about antioxidant-rich foods and polyphenols and used those hedging words I had seen before. She didn't promise a cure. She spoke of support, association, and complementary approaches. Still, as she talked about the flavors of blueberries and the tang of pomegranate, something inside me stacked into place. I had started this small habit for myself. Now I had the additional language to describe it without claiming more than it deserved. When I left the center that day, the bag of blueberries had been replaced with a sense of companionship. The road ahead remained uncertain. There would be tests, conversations, and nights when names would still evaporate. Luciana and I would keep crossing the bridge between care and control. But for the first time in months, I felt the stirrings of hope that were not dependent on someone else's schedule. I had a small arsenal: a bowl of fruit, a classroom, a walk, the companionship of neighbors. I had, most importantly, the knowledge that I could act for myself. The 2 fruits were now part of a ritual that began each morning at my little table by the window. They were not a cure, and I would not let anyone reduce my experience to a marketing line. They were a practice. They were a way of reminding myself that I am entitled to small acts of preservation and pleasure. And on nights when the fear crept back, I could open my diary and find the line that stopped me like a steady hand. Woke, blueberries, taught at 10. Still, there was more to be said and more to be done. There are downstairs conversations I've not yet had with Roberto, family meetings that will require patience, and medical follow-ups that will demand my honesty. Perhaps most of all, there is the larger question: can small, sustained choices like those I made truly alter the course of a life marked by memory loss? I cannot answer that for anyone else. I can only offer what happened to me. That night, I sat by the window with an empty bowl. Above the bakery, the stars were clear, tiny, and indifferent. And I felt in the marrow of me the truth that story is not a straight line. It is a series of evenings, of meals, of phone calls, of notes found in the mailbox, of hands clasped in kitchens. I lifted the diary from the table and wrote in the margin of the page, "Not cured, not resigned, moving." Then I closed the book and listened for the sound of the city settling. When the phone rang the next morning, it was Luciana. Her voice carried an urgency I did not expect. "Mom," she said quickly, "there's a meeting next week at the clinic. They want to run more tests." For a moment, old fear pressed against my throat. Then something steadied me. The bowl on the counter, the diary on the nightstand, the students who had learned to read. I folded the line of my life like paper and tucked it into my bag. "Okay," I said, "I'll go." And I knew I would go, not because I was helpless, but because I was refusing to let anyone else tell my story for me. There is a crossing ahead that I have not yet made. I have told you the beginning, the loss, the move, the condescension, the small rebellion, the 2 fruits that became a ritual, the return to teaching, and the slow, steady improvement that felt like a sunrise. But the horizon holds more: tests to be faced, family dynamics that must be negotiated, and the question of just how much we can change with small acts. I am still living it. I am still learning how to tell it. If you are with me, listening now, know this: when they say you're losing it, listen to the parts of you that still remember how to fight. Gather your small rituals, keep a diary, Find the people who will sit at the table and pass you the magazine without judgment. And before you make any health decisions based on what I'm telling you, please speak to a physician. This is my personal experience, not medical advice. And if you have a story like mine, or if you're caring for someone who does, share it below. We are better when we know we are not alone. Share this with someone who needs a little hope. Check the description for reputable resources about diet and cognitive health and for links I found helpful. Today, I will go to the clinic. I will walk in with my bowl of fruit in my bag, my diary tucked under my arm, and the memory of Paulo's letter in my pocket like a talisman. I do not know what the tests will say next, but I have learned one undeniable thing. Reclaiming your life is an action, small and stubborn, repeated day after day. When the doctor's nurse calls my name in the bright clinic room and I stand up, my hands will be steady enough to hold my own story. When the nurse called my name, I folded the diary into my bag like a talisman and walked into the bright room where the light felt honest. My hands felt steady. They always do in front of people who expect something fragile from me. There's a small private rebellion in keeping calm. The tests were gentle and strange. The nurse handed me a pencil and said, "We'll do a few simple tasks. It helps us see how you're thinking today." She smiled the way people do when they want you to feel at ease, and I smiled back because I have never been good at looking small in front of a stranger. We named 3 objects, and then I had to ask her to repeat a short list of words. I scribbled them into the diary later, not because I thought anyone needed proof, but because the act of writing things down gives them weight. She asked me to draw a clock. I drew the circle and placed the hands like someone setting a table. The minute hand was a little high, the sort of playful error an old teacher might expect when students are still learning. And the nurse didn't flinch. She put a hand over the folder and said, "Thank you, Mr. Alda. The doctor will be with you shortly." The doctor arrived with folders and a careful manner. He listened as I told him the map, Paulo's letter, Carmen's table, the bowl of fruit, the Tuesday class. He lifted his eyebrows at the blueberries and pomegranate and nodded in that scientist's way that says, "Interesting." He explained in plain language I liked that memory and cognition are affected by many things: sleep, mood, physical health, social life, and that nutrition is one piece of a large puzzle. He was not dismissive. He did not inflate the fruits into something they are not. He framed the tests as markers, not as verdicts. "We can't say anything absolutely from a single visit," he told me, "but there are directions we can follow." He recommended continuing monitoring and asked if I would be willing to try a few structured exercises. Nothing like a cure, he said, but helpful in building habits. I told him I had already started a few of those exercises myself: the diary, the walking, the classes. He smiled like someone passing along a key to a lock he already suspected you could open. After the appointment, when I stepped into the hall and the light felt ordinary again, Luciana was waiting in the car like a small sculpture of worry. She began with a question that was practice for her. "What did he say? Are you okay?" I told her what the doctor had told me: no definitive answer, a plan to observe and support, and an invitation to continue the things that seemed to be helping. She listened. Once more, she held my hand like we were 2 people reading the same page. Walking back to my apartment that afternoon, I thought of all the small rituals we suppose are unimportant until they are the thing holding us together. The bowl of fruit felt less like an experiment and more like a companion. There is an intimacy in preparing fruit for oneself that resembles prayer. The careful quartering of a pomegranate, the soft, precise heap of blueberries, the way the hands move with a muscle memory older than worry. Over the next months, the rhythm of my life found new beats. I kept the diary and wrote 2 or 3 lines each night. The entries were not declarations of perfection. They were honest. Woke, blueberries, taught at 10, lost keys, found under cushion. The act of documenting made a difference. It anchored me. It let me see that losses were often followed by recoveries, the key misplaced and later found, the poem remembered after a morning of trying. The fruit ritual continued. Blueberries for the morning spoon, pomegranate seeds in the afternoon or tucked into a salad. Sometimes I would combine them over yogurt and think of them as a tiny festival, the blue and the red like small flags pinned to a cake. I never thought of them as medicine in a bottle. I thought of them as choices I could make, small declarations that said, I am still the author of my days. Small declarations, when repeated, accumulate into something sturdier. The students noticed. One of them, a woman named Sophia, who had once skipped classes because she said she felt too old to learn, began to bring me a grapefruit each week in thanks. It's not your fruit I mean to thank, she told me once, placing the citrus in my palm. It's your stubbornness. That word, stubbornness, became a kind of compliment I wore proudly. Family dinner nights shifted too. The first few times after my clinic visit, Luciana hovered with a pamphlet like a cloak. Roberto softened. There were fewer careless jokes at my expense and more questions that came from a place of curiosity rather than control. But we had to learn new ways of talking. One evening, as we sat around the table, Luciana asked, gently, would you be okay if we check in a little more, just to make sure? I looked at her then and saw not only the daughter who loves, but also the woman who has other responsibilities that tug at her. Yes, I said, but please ask me first, not later. She nodded, and we both felt a small relief as if a page had been turned. The big tests came with their own rituals, more appointments, a referral to a memory clinic, conversations with specialists who used words like monitoring and risk factors. At the clinic, I met other people who were walking similar routes. A retired carpenter who told me he had begun knitting to slow his hands. A woman who kept a painting of her grandchildren in a drawer because looking at it made words come easier. There was a quiet dignity in that room. We were not a chorus of victims. We were people trying to keep our stories intact. And yet, there were still nights when fear inched back, uninvited. I would wake with the sudden panic of having forgotten an appointment, a name, a line of a poem. Those nights, I would sit up, light on, and make a list of small things to do in the morning. Lists have a way of taming anxieties because they make tasks visible and finite. I would read my own handwriting and feel steadied by it. Community became, as it had always been for me, a place of reclamation. I set up a small reading group in my apartment building, nothing formal, just a few chairs pulled close, a thermos of tea, and a book someone wanted to tackle. The group offered both me and others a place to practice memory and conversation. We read aloud and discussed, we forgot and laughed and returned to the page. One man, Benedito, who had once refused to come because he said his hands shook too much, now sat with 2 hands folded on his lap and a clear voice that surprised him. I read the whole paragraph today, he told me, and we all applauded the way children applaud a small victory. The 2 fruits, always the blue of the blueberries and the deep jewel of the pomegranate, became as much social tokens as dietary choices. People would ask me why I ate them, and I would tell them the story, that a combination of habits, of moving my body, of reclaiming purpose, and yes, of adding a little fruit, had helped me feel more like myself. Some nodded, others tried them and reported small improvements in energy or mood. The conversation was sober. Nobody promised miracles. One afternoon, a new neighbor rang my doorbell, carrying a small plate. She introduced herself as Teresa's daughter and said, "My mother used to be scared of forgetting names. She started coming to the center because you made a place for her. I wanted to say thanks." She set the plate down. On it, tiny squares of sweetbread. I invited her in and poured tea. We talked about dishes and poems and the oddities of city buses. She told me, with a laugh, that she had started adding pomegranate to her salads because she liked the way the seeds clicked against her teeth like marbles. I told her about the diary, and she asked if she could borrow it as a model. I handed it to her, my handwriting a little clumsy in places, and felt the odd thrill of passing along a tool that had kept me steady. Not everything transformed in a tidy arc. There were setbacks, a misremembered appointment that left me embarrassed at the doctor's office, a lost line in the middle of a public reading that made my cheeks flesh. But what changed was the context in which those mishaps existed. They no longer shrank me into a single defining moment. Instead, they became small pauses in a longer sentence. My life, resumed in pieces, was more textured. There were still heavy days, and I learned to honor them without letting them define the weeks that followed. Luciana's own transformation moved at a different pace. She learned to ask, to listen, to give space rather than leap to solutions. She brought me a small notebook once with the words, "For our lists." Inside, she had written a schedule that included my classes, my doctor's appointment, and, penciled in with a hesitant hand, Geralda's walks. She had drawn a tiny pair of sneakers next to the word. "It helps me not feel helpless," she admitted. I squeezed her hand and said, "It helps me not feel managed." We both laughed at the clumsy honesty. The word that came back the most in the months after was purpose. When I taught, when a former student caught my eye and mouthed a thank you, I felt a current of value that substituted for what I feared I had lost. Teaching is an exercise in memory because it forces you to hold the past in the present and translate it for someone else's future. I began to view every class as practice, for my students, yes, but for my own mind as well. I developed little rituals to anchor the lessons, a rhyme, a hand gesture, a rhythm of clapping that helped both sides remember the lesson's heart. The rituals worked more often than they failed. As months shaped themselves into a new year, I received invitations I had not expected. A teacher at the high school arranged for me to give a talk about perseverance. A small public radio program asked if I would come and tell my story. Each invitation felt like a risk. Would I stumble? Would the microphone highlight the holes in my memory? But the truth is that vulnerability is also an instrument of courage. I decided to accept. The radio studio was small and smelled faintly of coffee and cables. The host was kind and asked simple questions that let me tell the story in the way I preferred. First the loss, then the stubbornness, then the bowl of blueberries and pomegranate. I was careful with my language. "This helped me," I said into the microphone. It was not a cure. It became part of a series of changes. After the broadcast, messages came. A woman from Vermont who had begun adding berries to her breakfast. A man whose mother had started a walking group. The messages were humble and sincere, and I kept them in an envelope with Paulo's letter. The clinic continued to monitor me. There were follow-up tests and small improvements noted here and there. The doctor spoke about risk reduction and modifiable factors and used the cautious language of belonging to a field that cannot promise certainty. When one specialist called the pattern I described encouraging, Luciana and I celebrated with a slice of cake that she had bought because we both agreed that small victories deserved edible proof. Books and studies began to appear in my awareness, not as absolutes, but as companions to what I felt. I read articles that suggested berries and certain plant compounds might be associated with cognitive support in some contexts. I read others that emphasized movement and social engagement. I kept a file of reputable links in my diary, short notes on where to find balanced information. And I insisted, whenever someone asked for advice, that they consult their physician first. The line between anecdote and evidence needed to remain clear. The most telling shift, perhaps, came in how people spoke of me. Where once they used pity or worry, over time they used words like teacher and neighbor and friend. Luciana's tone changed from "we must" to "how can I help?" Roberta learned to bring me tea without the syrup of condescension. He would say, "Tell me a story about Joanne," and then listen. My son Marcos, who lived in another part of the city but came by when he could, started leaving a folded paper on my counter with notes like, "Call me Thursday." One of his notes once read, "You held me up when I couldn't read street names. Thank you." These small acknowledgments accumulated like coins in a jar. One evening, a book arrived in the mail, a small collection of poems someone had gathered from former students. It included notes, some clumsy and heartfelt, some in shaky handwriting. Paulo's name appeared on the cover as one of the contributors. I sat at my little table and read each poem slowly, as if tasting something that needed savoring. Tears came in a way that surprised me. Not the hollow, frightened tears of the early days, but the wet, grateful ones of someone who has been given back a mirror. I do not want to flatten the story into a tidy lesson. There were moments when the conversation with Luciana sharpened into frustration. There were nights when I misread a line in a book and felt the old fear creep back. There were clinical notes that advised vigilance. But the larger arc of my life had shifted from the idea that I was a passive patient to the idea that I am an agent, someone who could act in small, consistent ways to hold on to the self I recognize. One winter morning, as snow softened the city below, I was invited to a small conference at the community college. The organizers wanted to feature local stories about aging with dignity. I agreed and prepared a short talk. I took the bus with my notes and a container of blueberries in my bag. At the front of the room, I spoke about the bowl of fruit and the diary in the Tuesday class. I told them about Paulo and Carmen and a community that kept its corners soft. Afterward, a young woman approached me. Her hair was tucked into a scarf and her hands trembled as she took mine. "My father keeps saying he's losing words," she said. "He's ashamed. He stopped reading. I don't know how to help him." I told her about small steps and about how the path is not one of dramatic gestures, but of steady rituals. "Start with the small things he likes," I said. "A walk he used to enjoy, a bowl of fruit he'll eat, a place where he can teach someone or be asked to tell a story. Call a doctor, yes, but remember the dignity piece." She looked at me like someone who had been handed a map, and for a moment I felt the full circle of what I had been given and what I could pass on. There was, finally, the matter of names. A month ago, I stood in the kitchen and read out loud the list of students from my very first adult literacy class. I did it as an exercise, mostly for myself. I said the names and told one-line stories about each person. When I reached the last name, I realized I had recited them without pausing, without the fog that had stolen names early on. The list was, I told myself, an indication that every gap had closed, but it was a sign that the muscle of recollection, like the muscle of a hand, grows stronger when it is used. There is a line I sometimes say to students. It comes from a teacher who taught me how to be patient with people and patient with time. We do not find our way back by magic. We find it by making small paths. Those small paths in my life have been walks and classes and a diary and the taste of berry and pomegranate seeds in the afternoon. They have also been the slow renegotiation of family roles, the conversation where you ask not to be managed, but to be included in decisions that concern you. I fought Alzheimer's. I say those words because that was how my life felt, an active resistance to being reduced without my consent. But I do not say them as a medical diagnosis I conquered like a duel. I say them as a testimony to the stubbornness of a life that refused to be written by others alone. I regained parts of my memory, names, rhythms, lines of poems, not by eating 2 fruits and waiting for a miracle, but by adopting a constellation of practices in which blueberries and pomegranate played a small but meaningful role. If you are caring for a parent, a grandparent, a friend, or if you worry about your own memory, here are 3 things I can tell you from where I stand. First, seek medical advice. Second, look for routines that restore dignity and purpose. Third, consider small, evidence-informed dietary choices as part of a broader plan. but always as a complement, not a replacement to professional care. Some studies suggest that certain plant compounds found in berries may support brain health in some contexts. That's useful to know. But what mattered most to me was the feeling of doing something that made me feel as if I were still authoring my own life. People often ask me now if I would do anything differently. It's a tempting question because hindsight wants to be neat. I suppose I would have asked for help earlier, in the way that honors me, that is, asking for assistance with a request rather than being moved and managed without consent. I would have kept the diary sooner. I would have insisted on continuing my classes. But I also understand that grief and fear make strange carvings in a life. I forgive myself for the ways I retreated. What matters is that I found the rope. The bowl is still a ritual. If you come to my kitchen, you'll find a small jar of pomegranate seeds and a carton of blueberries in the fridge. Some mornings I eat them over oatmeal. Sometimes I toss them into a salad. Sometimes I share them with a neighbor. Once, a child on the bus stole a blueberry and popped it into his mouth with a look of conspiratorial joy. I smiled. Those little acts are parts of the story. Before I go, there are the practical things you can find in the video description. Links to reputable resources about diet and cognitive health, the Alzheimer's Association for information and support, and my own short list of books and articles that helped me think clearly. Please consult your physician before changing your diet or starting any new regimen. This is my personal experience, not medical advice. If my story mattered to you, share it with someone who might need a measure of hope. If you are caring for someone, comment below. Tell us what has helped you. The world is shaped by small testimonies. They do more than comfort. They offer paths. Tonight, I will make the same bowl I make most mornings. I will sit by the window and look at the bakery's warm lights and the steady, indifferent stars that wink above. I will turn the pages of my diary and feel the weight of my days in my hands. I do not pretend this is an ending. There are more appointments, more conversations, nights of forgetting, and mornings of surprising recall. But I will continue to act for myself. I will keep picking food that tastes like small hope, showing up where my presence matters, and insisting, kindly, stubbornly, that my life remain mine. And when I stand in a bright clinic room and my name is called, I will rise with my hands steady enough to hold my story. If you're walking a similar path, take a pencil and write down a small thing you will do tomorrow. Make it a habit you can keep. Start with a bowl or a walk or a page in a notebook. It is not a guarantee. Nothing like that exists. But it is an action. Action, repeated, has its own quiet power. Thank you for listening to my story. Share it if you think someone else needs to hear that fighting for dignity is possible at any age. And please, speak with a healthcare professional about any concerns you have. If you want to know the specific fruits that helped me, check the description for the names and some reputable studies that discuss diet and cognition in cautious language. For me, the blue of the berries and the red of the pomegranate were small commitments that, alongside many other choices, helped me find pieces of myself again. I'll close the window now and make the kettle sing. The city hums below, ordinary and full of lives being made. I stand in my kitchen, bowl in hand, and feel quietly grateful for the people who sat at the table with me, for the student who sent a letter, for Carmen and Benedito, and the awkward, lovely way kindness arrives. I fought for a life that includes memory, yes, but more than that, a life that includes purpose. That fight continues. The bowl waits on the counter. The diary is open. The night is wide and full of possibility.